Hello and welcome to this episode of the Bible in Lent. Today, me and Archibald are going to be reading through Matthew 21 to 25. Archibald, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Joshua. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's a good day for us in Oxford. Matthew
Yes, well.
21. Now, when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent two disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them at once." This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, "Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, your king is coming unto you, humble, and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden." The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sent on them. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowd said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, "It is written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer,' but you make it a den of robbers." And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple and healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant. And they said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yes, have you never read, 'Out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies you have prepared praise'?" And leaving them, he went out to the city of Bethany and lodged there. In the morning, as he returned to the city, he became hungry, and seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And the fig tree withered at once. When the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, "How did the fig tree wither at once?" And Jesus answered them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you'll receive if you have faith." And when he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching, and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" Jesus answered them, "I'll ask you one question, and if you tell me the answer, then I will also tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, where did it come from heaven or from man?" And they discussed it among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say to us, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But if we say from man, we are afraid of the crowd, for they all hold that John was a prophet." So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And he said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. What do you think? A man has two sons, and he went to the first and said, 'Son, go and work in the vineyard today.' And he answered, 'I will not,' but afterward changed his mind and went. And he went to the other son and said the same. And he answered, 'I go, sir,' but did not go. Which of the two did the will of his father?" They said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes go into the kingdom of heaven before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even when you saw it, you did not afterwards change your minds and believe him. Hear another parable. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it, and dug a winepress in it, and built a tower and leased it to tenants, and went into another country. When the season for fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to get his fruit. And the tenants took his servant, beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other servants, more than the first, and they did the same to them. Finally he sent his son to them, saying, 'They will respect my son.' But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and have his inheritance.' And they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. When therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, what he will do to these tenants?" They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants, who will give him the fruits in their seasons." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, 'The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone'? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parable, they perceived that he was speaking about them. And although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowds because they held him to be a prophet. What are your initial thoughts to this set of passages?
Yes, I think it's interesting, as naturally the whole gospel is. And as it starts off where we see, I'm not quite sure. I think we reenacted some extent, I think, on Palm Sunday. But it's rather the reverence Jesus is treated with, where most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, the others cut branches in the street and spread them on the road. The reverence that Jesus is treated here, and then the stark difference between that and how he is treated within inside the temple in Jerusalem. Because they don't wish for him to sully his feet or even the feet of his donkey by going on to the, obviously in that era, the roads very dusty and dirty. And they went before him and almost announced Jesus, calling him obviously the Son of David, which is fulfilling the prophecy we see earlier in the Old Testament. And then once again, the crowds in Jerusalem say, "Who is this?" They proclaim this idea he is not the idea, but rather the truth that he is Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. And I think the painting of the table is very the temple itself is very interesting, because it seems it's become a place quite rather separate and quite distant from this idea of prayer, where it's not about reverence to God and reverence to prayer, but rather there are money lenders and there's there's money changers and seats of those who sold pigeons. It has become this sort of place of commerce over a place of God. And obviously Jesus doesn't take a very good light on it, of course, in Roberts. So that I think is most interesting indeed. What do you take from this passage?
I find the cleansing the temple is something that we've touched upon and find quite a curious passage, because when we're reading this section, what we see quite quickly is there's almost that dynamic between the idea of the temple being that of gods and of course the humans, that of us. We are in some sense we're buying and selling in the world, and it raises a very interesting question of, well, what is exactly the role that we're meant to incorporate this idea of commerce into our Christian lives? Because in some sense we are temples of gods. The Bible writes that we are temples of gods. We must worship ourselves as much as we worship God through ourselves in some sense. And I guess the question that is risen here is that on one hand, taking part in business, taking part in commerce is a good thing. But at the same time, there's almost this intrinsic warning that Christ is making, that we cannot make all of our life purely based on money. It doesn't matter if money is part of it, but I think it's the idea that we must purge any monetary desires from our souls to say, everything I do is first towards God, and everything else can come in the future. Because we could think about tithing, for example. The idea of money in the temple is not exactly something which is intrinsically or inherently wrong in itself. We should be bringing our tithes to the temple or to the holy place to give thanks to God. So it's not money, which is what Jesus is getting rid of, but rather that materialistic monetary mindset, which I think Christ is trying to remove.
And I think making money inside the church also just as a place, because in this sense of Judaism, the temple is absolutely paramount. It's where almost God is. It's a house of God. It's a central place of worship. Like I suppose the Mohammedans might view Mecca as their place of worship, where God is, rather than in the Christian sense, a church is wherever the body of Christ, where a community of gathering is. And I suppose in the Catholic sense, where we put a Christ in the form of the reserved Blessed Sacrament, we reserve sacrament there. We have Christ in residence. But even in this sense, our bodies making money is not a bad thing. Even God talks about all in the New Testament. Jesus, as we've seen, discusses this idea even of taking a wife. But we put God must be first. He is above absolutely everything else. God is paramount. So it doesn't have this. It doesn't exclude doing the rest of material existence. But God goes before it all. And yeah, that's most likely the teaching here.
And there's also two parables. I think in some sense the parable of the two sons is more straightforward. In some sense it just says it is about what we do and not about what we say. And the example is the first son, he says he will not go, but goes anyways reluctantly, but nevertheless goes and does what he's called to do. And the second son is someone who says, I will go, but then is reluctant and ends up not going. And it's quite clear that the first son who does his duty, despite his initial rejection, is the one which we want to act. And likewise, we must act on the calling of God and not just say we're Christians and not act in a Christian way. But the second one is, I suppose, more complex. And although I guess you could view this as an expression of Christ, and we need to understand when we're getting to Matthew 20, we're moving towards the Passion narrative, and that's kind of beginning soon. But when we're thinking about this idea, I was wondering what your initial reactions are to the parable of the tenants.
Well, it's quite interesting. I find that the part of scriptures, which is where it is the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing and is marvelous in our eyes. It's the part which perhaps we often reject. In this world, indeed, truth, perhaps Christ, perhaps God, is ironically the fundamental, where we don't wish to recognize something that is inordinately helpful. We see that when we were talking earlier in the series about martyrs and doing that of God. The truth is often rejected. And it's interesting that the parable I start off with as a master planted. The vineyards pop up a lot in Matthew. I'm not sure if there's something about that is particularly important. I'm sure there is. Tenants to each servants beat one of the fruits. I think it's there was the son. I think that's the interesting part where he sent his son saying they'll respect my son. He keeps on trying to make them respect. They'll respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill and have his inheritance." They took him, killed him, threw out of the vineyard, and killed him. And therefore the owner of the vineyard comes. What would he do to those tenants? They said to him, "He'll put those wretches to a miserable death. Let the vineyard out to other tenants who give them the fruits of their seasons." So it's getting it's taking away from those who don't produce fruit, and I think giving to people who do produce fruit. So it's really cutting the chaff from the wheat. We see it earlier, I suppose, of cutting away those who do no good, who do not bear good fruit to God. It's repeating again a very, very similar message to what we've seen before.
I agree with that, and I think that's an important aspect of Christianity. And there's this idea of God giving everyone so many chances to turn to Him, yet we continuously turn down those opportunities. Yeah. We oversee what God does for us, and oftentimes we get caught up with ephemeral things which help us or in this case harm us to see the truth and the provision that God has provided. Perhaps let's move on to chapter 22 and see how we can reflect on it.
And again Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son, and sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast. But they would not come. Again he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those who are invited, see, I've prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. The king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find.' And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but but few chosen. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. And they sent their disciples to him, along with Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then, what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. And he said to them, Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When they heard this, they marveled, and they left him and went away. The same day the Sadducees came to him, who say there is no resurrection. And they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses said, If a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. So too the second and the third, down to the 7th. After all of them, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all had her. But Jesus answered them, You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not heard what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Now while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, The son of David. And he said to them, How is it then that David in the Spirit calls him Lord? Saying, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. If the David calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. So, what are your initial thoughts here, Joshua?
I think there's a few aspects, Mr. Elliot. First of all, there is the parable of the wedding feast, which is quite a fascinating one. I've been very much perplexed by this all for quite a while. Not necessarily because of its form. I think the idea of God inviting first those who were invited and begging them to come, yet they did not listen, is perhaps a more explicit reference to the Jews who were given first the covenant by God in the Old Testament, yet constantly rejected it. And upon the rejection of the Jews, Christ then turns to the Gentiles and invites the Gentiles in, and they do come in and they do receive the message of Christ. And I think if we look at the world today, most of the Christian body are not the Jews, but rather most of the Gentile population, what can be considered the Gentiles. And I think that's quite prophetic, but also quite expressive of the situation. Now, what I think is interesting here, and what has confused me in the past, is about the man without a wedding garment. For if God invites in all, and some people perhaps are not prepared or unable to be prepared, we don't know, of course, why the person did not come in without a wedding garment. Perhaps the person was poor and could not afford one, or perhaps they just decided not to turn up in their best robes. He gets disposed of. I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, because on one hand you could read and say that's kind of strange that God would dispose of this person who's accepted.
I think it's only strange if we treat it in a literal manner. But we must remember this is a parable. The wedding feast is representing, I suppose, that of heaven, that of the kingdom of heaven. And those who reject Christ are not let in. And perhaps those who even accept Christ. But in this case, I think the wedding garment, represents, in much the same sense we have fruits representing certain things in earlier parables. Here, the wedding garment is, I suppose, that which is worthy of God. So perhaps that of repentance, that of submission to God's will. So in this sense, the wedding garment is he's come to the Lord's table to share in the Lord's Supper, to indeed share in the wedding feast of heaven. But he isn't prepared for it. To go to a wedding, one buys better clothes, or one's tailor's made better clothes, and dresses up smartly and comes along in full glory, as indeed the celebration is worthy of it. And he is appearing at such a great wedding feast, not even dressed for the occasion. And here, I think it's not a literal sense. He's not having to, go to his tailor and say, yes, make me wonderful things. I have to go here. He's not being lazy in that regard, but rather he's been lazy by not preparing as what God commands us to do to enter heaven. He's not fulfilled that requirement. In this sense, he's saying, bind him hand and foot and cast him to the outer darkness. I think here talking of hell being entire separation of God, something that often we think perhaps we have the threat of punishment, and that's why we do what we do to God, because we love him. But we don't often recognize this horrid place that hell is, where Satan resides, that of outer darkness and cut off from God. And in that place there should be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I think the last line, positions this parable. For many are called, but few are chosen. Because even whilst Christ's body in the Christian church is indeed the chosen people, again, they are the elect. They're called, but few are chosen unless they indeed live the Christian life to greater lessons and repent for their sins and want a closer union with God. So I think that's where this idea of the wedding garment comes in. It's speaking again in this metaphorical sense, as most of the parables do.
I definitely agree with
your questions about it.
Yes, I believe that's a good way to look at it. And in fact, I think that ties on to the later passage on render unto Caesar, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, unto God what is God. It's often quoted passage, but I think it gets at the heart of, I guess, how we're meant to live our lives. It's not to say we must conform to all political governments, but I do think it demonstrates a need to say, well, we live both in the world and also we live for God. We need to live for God, but also that does not then mean that we can just alleviate ourselves of all social and political and worldly responsibilities. We have a dual duty, perhaps, that we must attend, and it's an argument against quietism, perhaps.
Well, there is a dear friend of both of us who does like to quote, "One must give unto Caesar what is due to Caesar, and not a penny more, except nothing is indeed, in his view, due to Caesar. So nothing indeed to be paid."
Yes.
So yes, it's indeed an interesting passage, and I think it's I think that the other two important parts, the teaching that often come up, which are, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and you shall love thy neighbor as thyself. That's, I suppose, it's again a central tenet of Christian teaching. We must love God above, as we said, and even repeated in the previous parable. Love God above all is fundamentally important. And loving your neighbor as yourself, I think, is having a sense of Christian charity. And I suppose even perhaps it's often accused that if we call someone out for their simple behavior, it's suddenly not loving them as your neighbor as you love yourself. But you see, if I was on a wrong path, I think there is nothing better and nothing more loving than, as a parent might do to a child, to set someone straight, set them onto the straight and narrow, and have strong discussions. So I think it's very important it comes from a place of wishing someone to do the best, to have a greater unity and communion with God, and not for their downfall. Because if you wish for anyone's downfall, is I think never something that's particularly beneficial for either party.
I think that's so true when you're interacting with other people. It's of great care that you're acting in their best interest, not only of your own. And that's something, it's a good approach to do when we're interacting with anyone, I think, for that matter. And it's a helpful tool to have. Perhaps we can now move to Matthew 23 and carry on of our Bible reading. Matthew 23. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them but with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. And they love the place of honor at feasts and best seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father, who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and who humbles himself will be exalted. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel across the sea and land to make a single proselyte. And when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is bound by his oath. You blind men, for what is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, and the outside may also be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanliness. So you are outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourself that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up, then, the measure of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify. Some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth. From the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Barachiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and the stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you are not willing? See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. What are your initial reactions to this passage?
Well, it's quite a powerful passage at the end. There's this notion that people again and again do not listen. There's been many prophets sent, as he lays quite bare, from Abel to the blood of Zechariah, and they've all been, their blood has been shed. They are prophets from God, and I think this lament at the end is particularly powerful. I'll read it again. The O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. That the city just again and again does not listen, and again we'll not see it properly. Your house is left to you desolate until they accept that of God. And I think it's the case in most places that life is rather desolate until one accepts God. Even the purpose of one's life is rather desolate until one accepts God. And blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The Lord, God is indeed the most important above all. It's like when we go, I suppose, into places that are rather dead. There's usually they're rather godless in some greater or lesser sense. But how do you view this passage?
I think the passage is somewhat self-explanatory, powerful but self-explanatory. There's this challenge against hypocrisy, which I think it's something which Christians we struggle very strongly with. I know I struggle with it a lot in some sense. There's the idea of do not try to cast out the mote in your brother's eye if you have not cast out the mote in your own eye. And in that very much in that sense, it's not necessarily wrong to warn people of sins, but it's also very important that we also inwardly look and reflect on our own sin. And sometimes that's the most difficult thing to do, to look at our own weaknesses and our own flaws as well. And I think this passage is promoting that kind of equal and that openness towards both our imperfections and others.
I think it's recognizing that we are all sinners. That's generally the sense. We are sinners, I think, at the end of the day.
Yes, indeed. Perhaps we can move on to the next chapter, just because this chapter is rather self-explanatory.
Yes, indeed. Jesus left the temple and was going away, when his disciples came to point out to him the building of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the mountain of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming, and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth of pains. Then they will deliver up to tribulation, and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away, betray one another, and hate one another. But many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. So when you see the abomination of the desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be greater tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, 'Look, he is in the wilderness,' do not go out. If they say, 'Look, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Whenever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of man, the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be left in the field. One will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake, and would not let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and the wise servant, whom his master has set over his household, to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is the servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set them over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants, and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces, and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So yeah, a rather powerful, I think, chapter of Matthew that we've read so far. What do you think on it?
I think this, like the last chapter, is also somewhat self-explanatory, but I think they all resolve around the theme of the end times. But more importantly, the idea that no one really knows when the end times are, and that we should not be deceived by false prophets and proclamations of the end times or of Christ coming again. And this is something which we see a lot in the church and a lot on social media, people saying, oh, I see these signs. I saw quite a humorous reel on my Instagram of someone going to the Middle East and filming a lake and saying, oh, the river has dried up, and I hear angels screaming out of the cracks of the desert. It's the end times now. And there's a lot of these things going around, but it's very important that we look at it and say, look, let's take it slow. Let's take it with patience. We do not know when the end time is, and we should always act as if the end times could come soon, but we should not act as if the end times actually do come soon. And I think there's also a very interesting idea. Once again, there's a rehashing of the theme of trials and tribulations, but more importantly, there's the idea that there will be many false prophets. Where the corpse is, so too will the vultures gather. And I think that's an interesting idea. The idea that the most dangerous message doesn't necessarily provide a new truth, but rather distorts the truth. I mean, I guess my attention falls immediately to Islam and the other sects and heresies. Because, for example, go ahead. Because I was just saying that the Muslims themselves, they say, oh, the Bible has been distorted, or, oh, certain ideas have been distorted. We have a new gospel, we have a new idea, and we should spread it around the world. A lot of these things are very dangerous, and we need to remember that the truth is not within the Quran, but rather within the Holy Scriptures, which have been guarded by centuries by the Church.
Well, I find it quite ironic, considering the Quran tries to take a lot of the proper scripture and then distort it itself. It claims the scripture they take it from is indeed itself distorted. After all, to get someone to believe something, it's much easier and much more palatable to take take the truth and distort it so it becomes away from the intention of the truth, because it seems more true than to create something entirely false. It's easier to take truth and make it false. And I suppose in this sense of the end times, we must indeed treat them, I suppose in some sense, we're bound to God, as if they do always happen. I think that's what's interesting, the signs, perhaps they can always be seen, because again, we must be aware we don't know when it is. It's some point in the future. We should not know when. So we should not really treat them as they're, I suppose, in some sense, they don't need to worry about them at all. I suppose in some sense we don't need to worry about them in any sense. We should just merely render our due to God and live a Christian life. There's an interesting line that I suppose occurs from when we were discussing the parable of the wedding feast in a prior chapter. About the line is repeated at the end of here. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I mean, it appears, again, I think from memory, it appears somewhere in the book of the Apocalypse. A similar symbolism is again created, or perhaps you might better know it as the book of Revelation, depending on which translation one uses. And I think it's painting this idea that where these hypocrites are put, where the servant who thinks, oh, his master has not come back yet, and so therefore starts to beat the servants and act in a very disdainful and rather horrific manner. he should be put in that place where he'll be cut up and put there. And I think it's quite an apocalyptic chapter of Matthew here. I think laying quite bare what shall come, but also, I suppose, in some sense, there's comfort that God is, as we know, is all loving and loves us deeply. And so I suppose it would pain him greatly if he was to have to cut us down. But justice, again, must be dealt if we don't deal justice, or by at least God does not deal justice, we start to lose really meaning for a lot of things. But it's again, yes, it is indeed relatively self-explanatory, but it's still powerful nonetheless.
I thoroughly agree with you. Perhaps we could move on to the last chapter of today,
Indeed,
Matthew
yes.
25. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, 5 of them were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. The wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, "Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all the virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." The wise answered, saying, "Since there will be not enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves." And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he answered, "Truly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." The parable of the talents. For it would be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had received the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, "Master, you have delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 more." His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master." And he also who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, "Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more." His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master." He also who had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, "Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours." But his master answered him, "You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scatter no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. When the Son of Man comes into his glory, and the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him he will be gathered from all nations, and he will separate people one from another, as shepherds separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to the one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they will also answer, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger or naked, or sick or in prison, and did not minister to you?" Then he will say to them, "Truly I say to you, as you did not do it for one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. But these will go away into eternal punishment, and the righteous into eternal life." What are your thoughts on this passage?
I suppose that it's quite an interesting one, especially the parable of the talents. And the talents on here is not necessarily as a talent that you pass, or talented in music, or talented in art, but a talent is a monetary unit worth about 20 years' wages for labourers. So it's a relatively considerable amount of money, and it's quite an odd parable in some sense, because you were throwing this almost slave out to. I mean, the Latin word cited for say servus both imply slave or servant. It depends how it's translated. And I think it's about putting our abilities to work on earth. We should not just languish on earth as and not bettering anyone, not bettering anything, not putting the gifts we are given by God to work, or at least to some effort. And that the one who is lazy and puts no doesn't wish to better oneself or better one's community or help others, or indeed render to God a great duty, and not necessarily in a monetary sense, it's a parable after all, will be again cast out into this place of great darkness, where we again have this repetition of where there should be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And that's, again, is a rather stark reminder of the potentiality of hell and separation from God. I wonder what you think on this parable.
I think it's a very interesting parable, because in some sense there is on one hand the idea that one must work with one's talents. But of course there's always that internal fear of saying, well, what if the one person tried to work and then ended up losing all his money in his work? What will happen then? Now, in that circumstance, I really don't know what the answer would precisely be. Perhaps it's the intention which matters, and that we too must just do our best and let God deal with the rest. And perhaps that is the attention we have to have. Though perhaps moving onwards, I think there is that idea of the need to be careful, caring to the weak and the suffering, those in prison, those who are hungry.
Yes.
And I wonder what you think about this, because sometimes when we see homeless people, I want to help them. But at the same time, sometimes when I help these homeless people, you never know whether they truly are homeless or not, or whether they're trying to take advantage of your money or your resources. What are your thoughts on that, and how does one act in relation to this?
Well, so helping is again, it's a subjective sense. Only God really will know. I think the intention is what matters. So in that sense, I personally I think money is not particularly useful. I mean, £10 doesn't make overly much difference, but I think there's something I quite like. I do mean to get involved more, but I think giving them food as usually better, or the order of multitude great things, and donating to charities that can actually put a meaningful usage on the usage of the money and put it to better use, and again a greater impact that can be achieved, or even putting one's time into such an endeavour, I think is indeed a great thing. And even when we have this sense of the day of judgment that Matthew talked about here, and it was, for when I was hungry, you gave me food, and I was thirsty, you gave me string, I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. It's saying that they recognise God. It's not with God in the good times. Only when everything's going well, we praise, we have God, and we say it's so good. And when something turns bad, we curse him, we throw him out of our lives, and we say, I have no need for it. It's all terrible, and so on. Or indeed, for the reverse, when it's all going absolutely well, we say, oh yes, no need for God, I'm wonderful by myself. And when it's bad times, we suddenly pray to God, asking for all sorts of things. It's being with God consistently, and not just when it suits. I think that's another, again, a teaching here. It's rendering one's duty to God, irregardless of circumstance or perspective. It's always there. It's something that is omnipresent. It's entirely necessary.
I completely agree with you on that perspective. Serving God throughout all times, regardless of our circumstances, is such an important idea. I hope you've enjoyed this Bible study. Make sure to like and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay safe. See you soon. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. I'll see you next one.